All right, we're up and running. What is up, everyone? Nice little Thanksgiving live stream here. I want to make sure this works, so just gonna pop open this and
Oh, it's just the cleaner.
a live Q&A and see kind of what questions come across, and as well just answer generic questions we've received across the week. As always, welcome everyone, and I hope you've had a wonderful Thanksgiving. But Adam, if you'd like to maybe start us off, and do you have any questions booked up from this week's work? I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah. Well, I guess this is quite a common one going with the holiday theme, and you've probably been asked this a million times. But people ask, how do I stay on track, being a bodybuilder around,
Yeah.
Thanksgiving, around Christmas, around family events? And I guess this is my take on it. I think it is a balance between enjoying yourself with family and trying to be a somewhat normal individual, but also being mindful of your goals. So what I mean by that is, me personally, if I've got like a family event on, or let's say Thanksgiving dinner or something like that, my sort of way I would plan for it or plan out my day is one, I personally like training on holidays, regardless of what holiday it is. So I
Yeah.
personally will always train, and especially the day after too, because I've consumed a bunch of food, restored glycogen stores. I'm feeling nice and strong. So I like to train the day of and the day after, even the day before. And what I typically do on the day, at least nutritionally, is I will have basically protein and vegetable feedings leading up to the event. So morning, basically just protein and micronutrients. So like egg white scramble with like spinach and tomatoes or something like that. Lunch, same thing. Bunch of vegetables to fill myself up and some lean protein sources. So by the time I've got to the event, if it's in the evening, I've basically created this huge caloric buffer as well as pretty much hit my protein intake for the day, so that I know I can eat, without really tracking or bringing my scale or annoying everyone, and still pretty much hit my goals. Whereas, many individuals approach, the holidays or, family events like, oh, it's the holidays, I'm just going to eat shit the whole day and not train. When I think, hey, you can sort of do both, but still enjoy yourself. Like, I like the fact that, yeah, I'm going to have a high caloric meal. I've just trained my ass off that day. So it's going to be fine. And also, it's going to fuel the next meal. And usually, when I have that approach, I usually don't, I don't lose any progress really. And
Yeah.
sometimes I even can progress. I've literally had a Christmas before where I got leaner going into the new year,
Yeah.
because I basically just used Christmas and like New Year's Day as like a refeed. And it continued fine. But the only reason it worked is because I planned ahead and just didn't, just go completely off the rails. Like, still, enjoy yourself and eat your stuff, but just be mindful about how you plan. At least nutritionally, that's how I approach things.
Yeah, I think it's so important, right? Because and I made a video about this, but once you get to a certain point, and arguably like the point you and I are at, where I'm my maintenance like level of body weight when I'm not trying to push is like usually sitting around 230 to 240, and it's pretty hard to get fat at our weight. And arguably, when you don't eat enough, you are just objectively going to lose weight without even trying to. So my approach is very much like yours. Well, I'll treat the day the same as any other, except maybe, I'll go train, I'll go do cardio, I'll have all the normalcies that I typically do. But the only differences are going to be that the meals leading up to the event, whatever the event might be, in this case, Thanksgiving or Christmas or what have you, I always am attempting to restrict a little bit of carbohydrate and maybe just mostly biased protein and fats, if even having fats. Then during the meal of the event, I think this is a really big psychological thing. It's like you kind of have to understand that this is not the only event that you'll ever have in your life, and you don't need to eat like it is. And most of these events are for engaging socially and having some form of a social life and building those connections that last a lifetime, not necessarily to indulge yourself to a point of sickness. It's to be there with friends and family. So when you're at the event, like, I sure as shit guarantee that there's going to be forms of protein and forms of low caloric intake produce, right? Like vegetables of some kind. So, for instance, we had Thanksgiving today, and I ate like a shit ton of turkey, like a lot of turkey, cranberry sauce on the turkey, and green beans. And that was like, that was my, Thanksgiving meal. And then I had a slice of like the tiniest slice ever of pumpkin pie. And I'm very content with that. And I honestly, it filled me up to a point where I'm uh, not hungry still, and it's 6 hours later, and I'm get probably going to lose weight tomorrow. The only thing I did was I just ate an abundance of protein. Like I probably ate 16 ounces of turkey or what have you. But again, I'm usually eating 7 ounces to 200 grams of proteins per meal about 5 to 6 times a day. So adding it all up, like I'm actually going to probably be net negative or net neutral on my total caloric intake. And I think that's just the biggest thing is when you eat those really high dense carbohydrate sources. So like a big popular dish in America for Thanksgiving is like having some form of like squash or sweet potato with marshmallows in it. It's like a serving of normal
Fuck.
food that you have with your entree. Yeah, right? It's like how could you make it worse? So they put sugar, brown sugar, and marshmallows in this like thing, and you get like this potato casserole essentially. And that's like everyone's favorite. Don't eat that. Like that's the thing that's going to spike insulin up, and you're going to be
Yeah,
wildly hungry afterwards. And it's like the satiation that you'll experience from eating a large amount of that versus a large amount of turkey, wildly different. Like the turkey is going to make you so full so quick, whereas that's almost going to encourage more hunger almost immediately because of its low volume, high sugar content. And our brain tends to love those things, so it signals I want more. Don't even feed into that, right? Like just if
mm,
and I'm a big proponent of taste testing. If you see something that you love, taste test, but you don't have to eat the whole thing. And as bodybuilders, like I think we tend to finish our plates, and that's just sort of like ingrained in what we do. And so taste
yes.
testing can be this really nice thing where you put a small serving, a very fractional serving of what everyone else is taking, and you just have a bite. Like, and that's enough, right? And that's the really
Yeah.
beautiful thing is like self-control is so powerful because you can have a bite, understand why people enjoy it so much, and say that was good. But why do you need to eat more? Realistically, like there's no functional reason to eat more outside of really regretting it the next day. So
Yeah.
that's kind of how I look at it. And I also, because I've done this before, right? Like I've had those moments where I do binge eat and it's not fun and I do regret it. And then
Mm,
the valence that I connect with that event was negative, and like the people I hung out with, and it was supposed to be a positive event, and now I'm like I feel gross afterwards. I'm regretting eating. Why did I even go to this thing? I don't want to feel that way. I know what it feels like, and I've kind of taught myself through that sort of failure in a sense that I probably should moderate how I eat and what I eat in this sense, and not just completely go off the rails into a different dimension with the food I'm eating.
yeah. Completely agree with you there, man. And then this is a bit more of a controversial hack, and then I think probably know where I'm going with this, but I'll caveat this by saying I don't recommend you use this to eat like an asshole. I don't recommend you use this to not to do what we just spoke about putting in place. But let's say you really want to mitigate things even further. There are some pharmacological options. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure Colton, you're familiar with Orlistat or Xenical. It's basically a lipase inhibitor. It's
Hmm.
an obesity medication which basically prevents lipase or basically dietary fat being absorbed in the intestinal tract. So basically, what you can typically do is prior to an event like this, where yes, turkey is great in its protein, but as you know, it's higher fat content. But basically, consuming 120 milligrams of orlistat prior to eating here will prevent the dietary fat from being absorbed, and basically you shit it out the next day, which reduces the caloric amount eaten. Now, the only thing I preface this by saying, like, don't go in there being like, oh, I've got orlistat, I can just eat like an asshole. Like, no, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't
Yeah.
stop all the lipase from being absorbed. Rather all the dietary fat from being absorbed, simply reduces it, and also it does take a little bit of a toll on the intestinal tract. Like, this is not something which you want to be like, oh, I'm going to use this every day, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Uh, don't recommend that.
Yeah.
You can also use a bit of metformin post or pre meal, so to speak, for a bit more blood glucose control, which can assist. And then I don't recommend you doing this too, but I've done it before too. Is that you can sort of try suppress your appetite through either just food, like I will have a protein feeding before I go to sort of reduce my
Yeah.
appetite, because I have a pretty huge appetite. Or you can use things like CAMP, which can suppress appetite if you know that you're someone who just is wildly will go out of control once they start eating. And if you put those in places with the practices we spoke about previously, which are the most important part, not the drugs, that in combination you should stay on track and basically still make progress.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really good point. And you could even, with metformin, it has this unique ability, especially when you take a lot of it, right? So like 2,000 milligrams plus, where it really upsets your stomach. And so if you're, if you're someone who, mechanically speaking, you can eat a lot of food, but like psychologically, it's like that's really the problem. Is it's triggering to you, and your brain just wants more. Using metformin prior to the event, so like 2 to 3 grams of metformin in a dose 2 hours before the event. One, you get that glucose mitigation, so you're not having ultimately like a ridiculous fasting blood glucose. But two, you'll almost upset your stomach before the event so that you won't want to eat as much as you maybe normally would. It's something I've used a lot, and through experiments and stuff, like last time we ate at the buffet with Steve, Vigorous Steve in Thailand or Bangkok, it was we had lipase inhibitors, or I had lipase inhibitors, and then I had 1,000 milligrams of metformin pre and post, and then I had 1,000 milligrams of berberine in the meal.
Oh
And I
man.
found that after the meal, I was wildly, wildly like sick. Not just like uncomfortable from eating food, but like my something wasn't right with my gut, right? So like I'm
Yeah.
getting fat squirts out my asshole, and I'm like my stomach just feels awful. The whole next day I was like, I don't feel like I don't want to eat, like I'm just gonna drink water, maybe have a coffee, and even that was like hard to stomach. So I kind of attempted to do something similar where I was like, I wonder what would happen if I took like 2 grams of metformin in just a moment in the morning as opposed to in the afternoon. And sure as shit, like it really unsettles your stomach and makes you feel just slightly uneasy. So in a way that's going to keep you from maybe over consuming, and um, in a way, restrict you without um, causing massive detriments, right? I think the other solution is a GLP-1 agonist, but then you're getting to a really expensive
Yeah.
solution to a problem that's more psychologically relevant. And we have Tito
Hard one.
using it
Yeah.
right now, and it seems to be quite effective for him. But it does seem that that could be a good utility if it is a really, like, if you're already predetermined that, hey, this is always a big problem for me, and some people's families do trigger them to eat more, eat more, eat more. Then that SGL, the sorry, the uh, oh my gosh, I'm thinking about SGLT2 inhibitors. No, of the GLP-1 agonists, that would be a good compound to select as opposed to, the variety of other things we could use.
Of
So
course. But yeah, just also KBSN with the active half life and how long the GLP-1 agonist
yeah,
lasts, that it may, basically push into other days of the week. And if you're in a surplus and trying to eat more food, well, probably not the best path to go.
right, right. And I think it's so important to say, like, this is a continuum too, right? I think, myself and you, or even better yet, someone like, just as a name that generally people know, Chase Irons on YouTube, he's 200, say 270 pounds. Like, he can go into Thanksgiving and tank it pretty well. Like, he's tanky in a sense of he can consume a lot of calories and not see the result of it. But a 120 pound, 110 pound bikini competitor can't do the same thing. Like, she's going to experience a large change in weight and body composition depending on how she eats on that given day. And so it's a situation where, like, maybe you have someone in prep who is in the open class for what have you reason, and they can actually get away as using that as a just a strategic high day. Whereas a bikini athlete, or maybe even a men's physique athlete, wouldn't have the sort of margin of error in caloric range that a higher level competitor would. And that's sort of the unfortunate part about being a female competitor or being a lower body weight male competitor, is like your margin of error is just so tight. And when you're in those events, you really have to keep it smart. Like, you really do. When you have a female who's in prep, eating 3 ounces of protein and a couple bits of vegetables for a meal, that Thanksgiving meal can easily go overboard quite fast. And that's where you get into that really big danger zone, I would say, for most potential weight gain.
Yeah. So, pro tip: take anabolics for 10 to 20 years, become a 300-pound bodybuilder, and you can do whatever you want on Thanksgiving.
Take anabolics so you can eat whatever you want on Thanksgiving. That's high key the best advice there is, honestly. There is nothing else. Don't worry about
Um,
anything else. Get jacked so you can literally eat whatever. That's basically the
exactly,
solution
exactly.
for Rich Piano did.
This actually leads into another topic of mine. If you don't have a question, I think it flows quite nicely. Is
No, go for it.
you've had a bunch of athletes compete. They do really well. They're pushed hard, but this is quite a common topic I have to see everyone. A lot of them are binging post show or having incredible hunger post show. How do we deal with that? What
Mm.
is your go to? I have a couple of things which I've implemented already, but what's your typical go to assist with that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I really do. Doctor Scott Stevens actually has a book called Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach, and he actually recommends some pretty good strategies for this in there. And I do kind of steal one of them from him, which is I don't think it's really stealing; it's kind of common knowledge. But I will generally sort of globally increase protein, and
Yeah,
like obviously we want calories to go up post show because we can't keep that person in a deprived state, but we don't want them to go as so far of an abundance that they rapidly store adipose and kind of ruin that rebound from the short or long in season whatever they had. So what I'll do is I'll increase protein to get calories up another 500 to 700, roughly, right? And in conjunction increase a little bit of carbohydrate. But the idea with the protein is it's going to again create more satiety, but also it's a highly thermogenic molecule and it takes a lot of work to store as adipose. So if I can have someone leverage a little bit more protein, or literally what I would call protein leveraging, ideally I can get them to be a little bit satiated, not have that food seeking behavior, increase calories without an exorbitant amount of weight gain. And then as we ease out of that like 4 to 5 week window where cravings are just really, really bad, then starting to shift that ratio where we kind of drop protein off and increase more strictly carbohydrate to beneficially aid towards that sort of IGF-1 slash insulin mediated hypertrophy. And then, again, try to use that protein as a molecule to strategically create satiety and be sort of a anti, I don't like to call it this, but like anti-fat storing macromolecule
yep,
versus just piling on the carbohydrates. Justin Harris, though, he does this differently where he'll actually have people do, so he'll have like strategies of deploying high days. So he was actually coaching me for like 1 week before I started working with Blue again. And he wanted me to do like 1,000 to 1,200 gram high days of carbohydrates, basically for 7 days straight, like rest day, non-rest day, just 7 days straight, and get it out of my system. Like just have a ton of calories going in, and you know how it feels to eat that much. I mean, it's really not fun after. It
yeah,
might be fun for 2 days, but then after that third day, you're like, dude, fuck all of this. Like I'm never doing this again. So I think it kind of washes that diet fatigue off really fast, and then you just come back to normalcy, and you still have those high days to count on and those off meals occasionally throughout the week, but the baseline diet isn't as bad now. That's another way I've seen it being successfully done. I typically go towards the higher protein and more stable diet versus this wide variability because I think that change in food volume can really mess with people, especially individuals who are more of a larger competitor who do have lots of hunger. It's much harder to keep them consistent when they're starving all the time if they don't have a great deal of willpower and discipline at that point already.
yep. No, I completely agree with you. Same thing here. I will also increase protein. I have done it across all the athletes currently. And then what I also typically do is I usually say, like, if the contest on Saturday, it's our check-ins on Tuesday, I usually say, hey, I'm not going to tell you to eat what you want on one day and then control. I say, from similar, sort of like a blended approach where similar to Justin Harris, I'll be like, okay, you have high days from the comp on Saturday to the check-in on Tuesday. But then what I want them to do is from the Tuesday onwards, from the check onwards, obviously I'm pretty much massively jack up their protein, almost anywhere from like even up to like 2 grams per pound, even
Yeah.
just to help with that. And then also what I do with them, I try to not get them on a meal plan specifically, but get them eating guidelines where we're going for the highly satiating food, which is
Hmm.
low density, low caloric density, high volume. So I say, eat your meat and potatoes, eat, your lettuce, add whatever barbecue sauce you want to make it taste better, condiments. But that way, it's a lot harder to eat like 4,000, 5,000 calories of like meat and potatoes and, meat and vegetables or even chicken and rice that way that they can satiate from the protein and all the high volume food. So much so that if they are eating till their stomach hurts, well, it's not donuts, it's potatoes, and also because
Yeah.
they've sort of had those few high days before and they've sort of half got it out of their system and can keep on track.
Yeah.
From pharmacological wise, I also, if they are enhanced athletes, I don't get them completely off the lipolytic agents just yet. Like I don't. I mean, we know the negative feedback loop with T3 and thyroid hormone, so we don't just drop that. But I would lower it to the extent that we're not getting any sort of detrimental side effects. So if are going, you should have dropped some of these agents like pre-show anyway to help deal with inflammation and any potential water retention. But basically titrate them down to the point they're in the background but still there. And then same thing with cardio. Won't completely stop the cardio cold turkey. We'll titrate it down. So instead of a cold turkey approach in the sense like, oh, we've finished the contest prep, let's just jack up food and stop everything. It's rather as titration down and subsequent increase in food. So titrate the lipolytic agents down, titrate the cardio down, but still keep it in place. And one, I guess, also new thing because of the obviously the rise of GLP-1 agonists, which I think is quite beneficial, is the last 4 weeks, like pre-contest, and last potentially 4 weeks post-contest. I think there's a lot of efficacy in deploying a GLP-1 agonist to help deal with that hunger, especially if athletes who have a history of binging post-show, where like 4 weeks later they're like 20, 30 pounds up, which is not good for water retention, not good for the organs, not good for the heart health, and your BP is going to go up, your blood marker is not going to look good. So if we can mitigate that with a GLP-1 agonist, I'd rather have that than that occur, and we basically have to do a massive health phase when really we should be trying to rebound and add as much lean fat-free tissue as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point on the lipolytics. I didn't mention that, but usually clenbuterol is a powerful repressant as well. And I think, one thing I see a lot when I am working with people, and I've been able to deploy this in some individuals, again, the more of the bigger bodied individuals, but I think a lot of coaches will lean towards immediately putting on a large dose of insulin because we're going to, catch this rebound. We're going to throw a bunch of carbohydrates in and we're going to use insulin. And, this is a thing I did in my rebound and it worked really successful, but I also have like an insane amount of willpower where I shut off, right? Like I don't need things. But one thing I noticed was using that high amount of insulin, it got to a point where, especially using Lantus, and I don't know if you've experienced this as well, but when I use Lantus, my hunger goes up quite drastically. Like it's a
Mm-hmm.
pretty rapid response. So, in that post show window, I think a lot of people will try to leverage as much insulin as possible as like the storage hormone. But what happens is you begin mediating the simple, like the very basic hunger response, and uh, almost creating like leptin resistance, which is going to make that hunger feedback loop just so dysregulated, and you will be food seeking like a motherfucker. So I usually try to stay away from insulin too, as a just a cautionary thing where I don't want people to. And here's another point, and this is almost a little sexist, but I think it's important to say: nut butters for females are just a complete no go in that post work, like in the
Oh,
post show window.
really?
The amount of females that I've literally had eat an butter. And like they make those fit butters and things, like it is scary. It is so common. It's like I know it's going to happen before it even happens. So I try to have people stay away from those. Like you kind of mentioned, staying away from those highly dense caloric foods. That is one of them. Like have an avocado. Don't have a ton of nut butter because that's just a recipe for disaster, because you can eat like an extra avocado and okay, 100 calories is not the best thing in the world, but it's not going to kill you. Whereas if you eat a jar of nut butter, which is about the same volume, you have a extra 1,000 calories in your hands that was completely void of any utilization, right? So you just almost essentially ate 1,000 calories that didn't feel like 1,000 calories. Now you can keep eating more and the cycle continues. So I try to have people stay away from nut butters as much as possible.
Yeah, that literally happened to a couple of competitors of mine, like the past weekend or so, where loading with the check-in was like I was eating what they say, like one was a tub of Nutella a day, one was a thing of nut butter a day, and I was like, ah.
Oh
Look, we've all
man.
been there. I'm not judging, but yeah, fucking the nut butters just kill us.
Yeah, that's the most I think they, the advertising smart because they call them fit nut butters and stuff, or like, they target towards competitors, obviously. And
Mm.
I just think that was such a bad, I mean, it was a great move for them because people buy it, but a bad move for like coaches because it's just a disaster. Like when a girl gets down there in calories and she's only able to use like 5 grams or 10 grams of nut butter, and she's looking at that whole jar and that spoon that still has nut butter on it, and she's like, well, what's a bite? And then it's just like game over. It's never gonna
Yeah.
work. It's always a bad idea.
Yeah. So we have none of those in our plan, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, no nut butters at all. Yeah, for sure. Um, okay, so and I had a question sort of revolving around holiday seasons and your opinions on this actually. So, for myself, like I'm in what I would call like I kind of nixed the idea of competing. I was staying at pretty low body fat and trying to restrict calories.
Mm.
I think, you probably saw the pictures of me in Bosnia where me and Hana were posing in the mirror, and I was like, I had my shirt up and I was doing the ab shot like this, and I was striated through my midsection, all that. I just kind of strayed away from that because I realized, well, I'm not going to be competing soon because right now there's Thanksgiving. We went to Bosnia. There's Christmas, and then we have to like sell all our things and then move to Thailand and then get settled in Thailand. And I'm just like, well, like realistically, going through a full on cut right now isn't going to be wildly effective. So I might as well, at least try to mass in some context. What is your kind of mindset when you're trying to navigate someone through the seasonal changes in body composition when you do come across the holidays? Is it a period where you're usually trying to have people lull a little bit, maybe maintain as opposed to mass or cuts, or is it something that you're like, we're going to hit one of these phases all the way through, and at the end of it, we'll kind of clean up whatever we need to from any mistakes that were had?
Yeah. Well, look, as you all know, it really depends what, or to give a bit more context, there will be a huge difference in the approach between like a bikini competitor and an open class bodybuilder. And also the approach will vary differently where, like in Australia, for instance, a lot of the season A, as they call it, they got season A and season B. Basically, it's not like America when there's shows all the time, but they got season A and season B. And correct me if I'm wrong, but season A is basically early in the year. And lots of the times the
Yeah,
preps have to start like November, December. So if you're an athlete who's competing there, unfortunately, there's no chance. But let's say we do have a choice for that. Typically, I think I prefer massing for most individuals simply because it creates that buffer or greater room for error. And
yeah,
most people psychologically don't want to be in a diet or deficit across a holiday period. So usually, if they are in a deficit period, I might even give them a diet break because it's one of those things where I don't look, unless they're super serious, and we obviously build that relationship with our athletes, and I can tell from the individual and the discussions we have, are they someone who can just like cut through or go through a holiday period? And if they're individual who's not, like, no judgment, we have a frank discussion about it and be like, okay, probably better if we just go at maintenance, so it's not a case of like, oh, I'm in a deficit, fuck out and binge, and then like the wheels fall off and people are like, oh well, I might as well just go all out. Rather we like, okay,
right.
let's increase food anyway so you don't feel as restricted and you go fine. And to be honest, if you are a larger male bodybuilder, then and you're in a surplus, I just say push through, use it as a high day if
Yeah,
required, and go that way. So personally, I think massing or maintenance is preferable for 90% of individuals over a holiday period, just because psychologically people see themselves in diets and then fuck out and there's family pressure and things like that. And when you're in a surplus, a larger bodybuilder, like I said, as you said, Chase, he was eating 5,000 6,000
yeah,
plus calories.
6,000 almost. Yeah,
He just misses breakfast. Like he can have Thanksgiving dinner,
yeah,
and
right,
he'll be fine. So
right.
it's the same with all my athletes and even myself. Even I will try to do it in such a way that I'm not in a deficit period in come December or come a holiday period like Thanksgiving.
Yeah, 100%. So and then I had another, so there was this and he might even be watching this once we post it or it lands, but there was another guy we were talking to on Instagram. He's going to get on a call with us. He ended up having to reschedule and then postpone after Thanksgiving, but really infamous YouTuber. I don't want to say the exact name, but
Really,
like a million plus subs, right? This guy wants to work with us, which I'm really excited about. But
bodybuilder,
even
no,
he was, what's that?
bodybuilder, no.
No, no, not a bodybuilder, actually like a gamer, which is really interesting, like a live streamer. But he
Interesting.
was he was he started TRT like a year ago, right? And went through this huge transformational weight loss journey and all that. Now he wants to obviously delve into more. He's looking really, honestly, really good, but wants to take it to the next level and actually like try to obtain that physique that you kind of think of when you're thinking about like a fitness model or what have you. And his first thought was just using nandrolone and that's it. So just nandrolone and then his TRT dose of testosterone. And
Okay.
I kind of mentioned that I might not do that. I might go towards a different route using some
Not the
DHT
worst I've heard,
derivatives.
but yeah.
And he thought, he's like, well, isn't like Mastron a cutting drug? Like he brought that kind of debate
Ah,
up, and I'm like, okay, I can see why you thought MPP or nandrolone would be the best option. So
yeah.
I think it brings up a good conversation where I don't think by now, at least I hope, I would give people the benefit of the doubt by understanding that there is no cutting or bulking drug. It's just like what you need to get the job done for your body and physiology. But in your kind of regiment, are you changing any compounds when you move into a fat loss phase versus a isolation of a just strict mass phase? Is there a obviously, you maybe throw in lipolytics, but like are androgens changing, or even some people go as far as changing GH brands, like growth hormone brands. What are you switching up, if anything at all?
Yep, yep. So I first will make the statement that I agree with you. There are no cutting drugs unless you're talking about like actual lipolytic agents. We talk about actual anabolics here. There are none, but there are some which I think can sort of be a bit more preferential for certain phases. The immediate answer, which comes to everyone's mind, is I don't think high dose of tren in any sort of gaining phases is beneficial. Just right off the bat, I think that is better deployed in a deficit phase or really a pre-contest phase. In fact, if you're just doing a normal deficit phase, don't. The only context where I think can be beneficial, which we've experimented with, is extremely low doses. Like I'm talking like
Mhm.
35 milligrams a week, just
Yeah.
even maybe 70 milligrams a week tops, where they are looking more for the nutrient partitioning sort of positive body composition effects that we can sort of get from trenbolone in the increase, conversion from T4 to T3. But even then, we have to check blood work and see is it worth it. Like previously, I just got some of my blood work back, and I'm wondering if that increase, like everything came back really fine, but I had a bit of prolactin level elevated, which was of course for multiple reasons, and I had a bit of my as we know that our liver enzymes are indicative of liver health. We look at GGT and cystatin C and things like that for liver and kidneys. But I was having a larger than normal elevation in liver enzymes, and I wonder, would that potentially be the detrimental or long term effect of that low dose trembolone? But I get too sidetracked. My point is that certain drugs like that, yes, I would include, but for the most part, I typically, with all athletes or individuals, say what works in the sense that what gives you the least side effect profile. Like I've had athletes or clients before where they take the tiniest bit of nandrolone during a massing phase, mad anxiety, and they
Yeah.
can't they can't function. So really, I think whether you're in a surplus or a deficit, it is for most individuals. I'm not saying a testosterone base for everyone, but usually a testosterone base, and then finding something which is going to be, the most well tolerated and give you the lowest side effect profile. So it's usually a DHT derivative, maybe Mestron, maybe a Primabol, and those are always the go-to. But some individuals, can really respond well to nandrolone. We know, look, a bit controversial. I know some people have strong opinions on equipoise or boldenone. Again, for
Mhm.
some individuals, it can be beneficial. Obviously, watch out for the renal toxicity or proposed renal toxicity. I know most of the studies were on animal studies. So again, I always say just get your blood work and see what's well
Yeah.
tolerated. But for me personally, because in a massing phase, we're going to titrate anabolics and escalate it. I would actually really stick to stuff that's going to be the least benign side effect profile wise, because I feel the titrations in a surplus are going to be potentially higher and more aggressive than a deficit. So in a deficit, maybe we can tolerate a little bit of trend pre-contest, but we want to be able to titrate these things whilst mitigating the side effects. So the only things I'd really change is anything that's like toxic, like obviously no orals, no, really, I guess, high side effect profile drugs like trembolone, I would include in my off season because I basically want to be as healthy as possible because I also have to deal with, the push up in weights. And as you all know, the increase in food and often the increase in weight can have more of a detriment to one's health Whereas often people pre-contest, they get better health markers. I mean, we have athletes, I think maybe yourself included, where you've done blood work and your health markers were looking great pre-contest because the increase in cardio, the increase in micronutrients, we're probably eating a lot
Right.
more, vegetables, and also the leaner body weight usually can actually improve health markers. So you want to view it in the context, at least in my opinion, of not really massing cutting drugs, but what is going to have the least health burden to allow me to push harder and for longer. And at least that's the way I approach it.
Yeah, that's you said two things that are really important too that I want to just kind of touch back on. One, you talked about potentially having higher and larger titrations in the off season versus competition or prep. And I think that's super important to state because in absence of everything, right? If we just in isolation put androgens in the situation, and let's say we have people evenly at 1500 calories a day, the group who has androgens in is definitely going to have a greater response to lean mass gains until they sort of hit their limit, whichever that limit is for 1500 calories. And then they need to titrate calories more to see a further response. Likewise, the group without the androgens likely would experience just a flat, sort of low and slow decline of lean mass across that period of time. But my point is that when someone gets to a certain level, the androgens are not going to do anything exorbitantly different than just being in a normal deficit. So using androgens in a deficit at a very high dose is almost impractical. It doesn't serve a purpose outside of just keeping and sustaining muscle mass and slightly changing the texture of your appearance, right? So in a sense, like using a lower dose pre-contest and then using maybe some of those more burdening compounds like trenbolone and the other orals can be effective. And like Adam said, my blood work, as well as many others I've worked with, does get much better on prep because it seems that the cardio, the low caloric intake, the really great insulin sensitivity, just in general brings down inflammation, brings down lipids. I mean, in a positive sense, not like your HDL, LDL, but your actual lipids. All these things get better. And so what you see in the off season is even in isolation with just a caloric surplus, people's health usually gets worse. But the off season is when you do have those calories to spare for anabolism, and calories are king. So if you can leverage more androgens in the off season, I think they would be much more beneficially or advantageously applied versus in season or a prep because you have that room to grow. You have the runway to sort of take off as opposed to not having anything to take off from. And I think that's really important to say is like the off season might be the only difference is you use more of each drug versus uh different drugs, right? And then the other thing was that the trenbolone you talked about, like even something as easy as when you are on a prep, I think trenbolone is the one that you would use, but easy is like 50 to 70 milligrams a week. I mean, you saw, I at least saw as, someone looking at your check-ins, a substantial change in your physique from 50 to 70 milligrams a week. And I think people hear that and they're like, whatever. But no, it's like that shit actually does a lot. Like 50 to 70 milligrams a week does a lot. And you're not having the annoying thermogenic effect of sweating while you sleep. And you're not having the sort of anxiety and, progestin mediated mental issues, right? You're having a lot of positive results without the negative outcomes, which is super important. And I would agree with you. There's probably arguably no change from into off season. It's just simply the same compounds, just a different dosage of each one is kind of how I'd see it. Like if I'm massing and I'm going to be my like go-to massing cycle is going to be testosterone, obviously, mastron, and if I can tolerate it well at the doses I'm at, equipoise. My prep is going to be the same, but in addition, I'm going to have trembolone, and that's like the only alteration that I'll have. Maybe some Winstrol or Anavar, depending on the situation. And so I think maybe stepping away from the idea that one compound has more of a benefit than the other is really important. It's just like, as you mentioned, just starting out, what is the lowest side effect profile I can achieve for the greatest results? Not like what's the highest side effect profile I can achieve for the most mid result. And I think
Yeah.
as far as starting out, not having experience, NPP can definitely be one of those that can give you an abundance of effects, as you said. And myself I have that this has happened too, where anxiety and almost panic situations on NPP, but seemingly on every other androgen, I'm perfectly fine. So I do think that's worth stating is again is like you want to use the drug that has the least side effect uh, ridden profile with the most results. And if that isn't what you are emotionally attached to, I'm sorry, but maybe just reevaluate, your emotional situation. Because I think what happens too is when people do get introduced to this stuff, there is a lot of more influential YouTubers who have more of a reach, but not as deep of an education. So they'll kind of talk about the lore behind a certain compound and what it can do for you. And it's just like selling supplements. And I don't think we realize it. Like people will talk about the benefits of using something, and it just sounds like this sounds good. This sounds even better. This sounds great. And it's just like they keep getting better. Why not? And it's the long-term associated effects of that don't typically get talked about too often. And same thing with forums too. You have this like infatuation with what is this guy taking? What is he doing? And it's like, oh, this will get you the results he's doing. And ultimately it won't. Nothing will. It's just the area under curve that you've been doing this for. Like how long have you been doing it for? That's going to get you the most results for your individual body and not anybody else's. 100%. So that was a great answer.
Yeah. One other thing I would like to also touch on when we talk about like surplus and deficit phases here, the deficit phase we talk about where there's a potential introduction of trenbolone, the Winstrol antibody, that we talk about like a contest prep. If you're just
Yeah.
going through a deficit phase, cut off some body fat, you do not need that. You don't need to suddenly introduce 200 plus milligrams of tren or just make up doses here or a bunch of oral fat. I would actually argue that if we're just a regular individual who's not competing, go from a surplus to a deficit phase, then the drugs probably don't change at all. Maybe you actually
Yeah.
lower the anabolic load, introduce, a low conservative dose of some lipolytic agents, maybe a little bit of clam, maybe T3, T4, maybe a little bit of your himbine. And that's the only real change. I wouldn't be like, okay, I'm cutting now. I need tren and orals. Like,
Yeah.
no, no.
Yeah.
So I like this. I realize most of maybe our listeners or my viewers aren't doing a contest and maybe just doing a simpler deficit phase. Please don't think that you need those compounds. In fact, I would say don't use them. Keep your
Yeah.
health intact and rather because the caloric deficit is not created by the trenbolone, it's created by your intake and expenditure, and that's going to be the biggest
Correct.
factor, not what drugs necessarily you're using.
Right. Yeah, and that's a very good point too. Is like if you're just non-discriminately transitioning into a cutting phase or a deficit, usually what happens, right, is like there'll be a high abundance of androgens, a high abundance of calories, and likely a higher abundance of adipose tissue at the end of your massing phase. But when you come off the androgens, even moving into a bridging or TRT phase, it's like the peak serum concentrations are there for a long time after that. So a really good situation is like to leverage that. Maybe you take that massing phase and you go right into a pretty aggressive deficit for 2 to 3 weeks, leveraging the plasma serum concentration slowly declining. And then you go back to sort of like a lower deficit, like a not lower, but I guess a higher deficit, right? Like having a little bit more calories to spare and less aggressive cardio. And arguably, when you're on TRT, what at least a bodybuilder is going to consider TRT, mitigation of muscle loss is not hard to do. Like it's just eat right, train hard, and have a little bit of testosterone. You're going to be fine. And I think that's really important. Like, as if you're entering a cut, you do not need just indiscriminately like all of these compounds, the cutters. You just need a decent diet with a good work ethic, and you're done. Like it's that easy sometimes.
Correct. And one other
Yeah.
final point is that people think that I think a lot of people overestimate how much muscle mass they have and how much it takes to retain it. Like the vast majority of people, I would actually make the argument like if you're 220 pounds under, I'm making a bit arbitrary number here. This could vary. If you're 5'1", it's going to be different, and you're 220 pounds. But if you're don't have a significant or advanced level of muscle mass, my argument is that you can almost cut on TRT plus doses, and you
Mhm.
don't need a boatload of androgens to cut. So going off what you said, I would, for most individuals, unless you're like, again, a really muscled advanced bodybuilder, you basically can go on like anywhere from, I would argue, 150 to 250 milligrams of testosterone, not lose any muscle mass if you're just doing a normal deficit phase, not a contest prep, not an aggressive get like, 3-4% body fat, but just a fat loss phase. You could easily drop to those, lower TRT doses and not lose any sort of muscle mass and complete muscle retention during that phase. And that's
Yeah.
sort of how I would approach it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think a lot of people are, some people might look at this and would be like, well, that's stupid because, I lost muscle when I went down to TRT and did a
Yeah.
deficit. And you're not losing muscle. Like it is so hard to lose muscle. It really is. You're losing fullness because you don't have any of that nitrogen retention that you had as a surplus of androgens. You're likely not using as high as a dose of GH or insulin, which is also causing like this super compensatory effect of like fullness, and you're certainly not having the fullness from the glycogen that you were eating lots of in the off season transitioning into a cut. So you're not just losing muscle, it's just you don't have that artificial sort of look to you that you would have in an off season where you're super full but on a fuck ton of androgens and stuff. So I think that's also conflated a lot, as like I'm less full so I therefore lost muscle. No,
Yes.
you just aren't eating as much, nor are you taking as much, so as a result you look less full. And that's huge, absolutely massive to think about too. We had a really good question from Fresh 67. He said, "Happy Thanksgiving. I can't think of any questions because I'm in a food coma. But what are your thoughts on go-to injection sites? I've been everything but calves and biceps. Where are bicep injection locations?" What are your thoughts there? For I guess we can start with like, what are your ideal injection sites?
Well, I first have to say, if we were talking, because it will vary if we're talking subcutaneous versus intramuscular. Okay, so typically I will approach it where if I'm doing like a health phase or TOC phase and the injection volume is quite low, like I would define low as less than 1 mil. Um, Daily, I personally would opt for, potentially a subcutaneous injection. To be honest, I personally find I seem to have a bit of sensitive skin. So
Me
over
too.
half a mil of fluid volume, subcutaneous gets a bit uncomfortable for me. So typically I don't actually go for over half a mil. If it becomes over half a mil, maybe, zero point 0.6, zero point 0.7, I would probably opt for intramuscular. So when it comes to subcutaneous, my preferred sites are basically all around the glutes and upper thighs. So basically the top band of the quad, basically where you basically have your hip flexors, so around there, because the tissue there is quite soft and often you have a fair bit more body fat there. So the subcutaneous injections I would do there, or basically, around my glute, maybe, around the glute medius, glute maximus, sort of that top end there. Then when it comes to intramuscular, personally, the same areas plus just more areas, I think, on the quads, which have less tissue. Sometimes I do find, side dolls can be okay too. But again, with that too, I don't like a lot of volume there too, because I think,
Mhm.
who was it? Maybe it was it Derek or Place More Day. It's just made a statement once that, like, where's the place where you would least want an abscess? Now, I'm not doing, unhygienic injection practices. And I really, really think people should pay attention to this and, be as hygienic as possible with all their administrations. But I do think worst case scenario, where would I want a piece of tissue cut out the least, and or rather, where would it be the most preferential place if I had to choose it? I usually
Yeah.
would say, yeah, like glutes or upper thigh, like not the fucking arms or the lats or
Hmm.
what little I have left on the calves. Nowhere, no one like that. So that's also what I think about. So hence why I go for those areas. So really, I personally rotate my quads, glutes, and delts. I know some people do lats, calves, pecs. I've tried all of those, and I usually find they are so annoying to get to that it's not worth it, especially when you're just using instances when you want to do it quick. And then my follow up question will be, well, Adam, well, if you're not using that many sites, well, what do you do about scar tissue? Remedial massage, scraping, they get basically like a metal, what do you call it, apparatus. It almost looks
Yeah.
like a,
It's a
I don't even know what to call it. You can Google it. It's a piece of metal thing. It's really painful. I basically just go over
really
all those
painful.
areas, and I work with my remedial masseuse, shout out to TK, and tell them, hey, scrape these areas and to break down that scar tissue so that with the rotation and that I don't have this crazy scar tissue all over the place.
Yeah, I'm very similar to you. I do quads because I just think that it can, for me at least, and I know a lot of people are controversial about quads, but for me, it can take a lot of volume and not have sensitivity issues. And it's generally like it's pretty hard to mess up if you, and you can look at nursing manuals. This is a really important thing, and like Adam said too, and I really encourage proper hygiene. Like I am the guy that will shower before shots and then use an alcohol swab and then dry it and then do it after like wiping each of the tops of the things, and you know what I mean. So I'm very, because I've had like painful swelling before, and it's not fun. So I just try to avoid it at all costs. So I'm big on the quads because you can do a lot there without stimulating any sort of issues, especially if you're doing it right. Again, use nursing manuals online because there's very step by step videos on how to do these kind of injections. But then I do quads, I do lats, I do side delts if it's lower volume. Like Adam said, I don't think, like, I usually think, where do I want swelling to least be, right? So like if something does get swollen, do I want my shoulder to be all lumpy and stuff when I'm doing like side lateral raises at the gym? Probably not. That's a bad look in my opinion. So I would usually do that if I'm doing lower volume injections. And then believe it or not, I actually really enjoy traps. And this is,
I'll try that.
I don't think many people think about traps, but it is, you don't have to use as deep of a needle. And again, I don't recommend putting like more than 3 cc's into your trap.
So like you go
I
there
would
or this
go like kind
shoulder
of like from my back. So
there.
it's, yep.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And just straight down.
Interesting.
And that I've found is completely like I don't feel it. I don't even recognize that it's there. And if it does get a little swollen, it's not the end of the world. Whereas if I'm doing it on my legs, like we're bipedal humans, so it's very hard to walk when you have a disrupted shot. When you're doing your shoulders, it's like same thing. You look like a weirdo. Lats is kind of uncomfortable because you use your lats in almost any sort of arm based movement, but traps is like you're relatively keeping them, like you're using your medial traps like on the middle to lower back, but you're not using those upper traps very often unless you're isolating that shrug, so you don't feel it too much, which I really do enjoy. And I try to practice that as much as I can. So I'll usually do sort of like Adam said, rotate between them. So I'll do like right quad, right lat, left lat, and then if I need to, right delt, left delt. But again, I typically am not injecting enough volume to um, justify using that many locations. In fact, I think when you're using like an ml or less, per injection, typically you can get away with injecting the same site multiple times. For example, the quad is huge. There's like you can think about the quad as like if you're, I know Adam injects towards his pocket. I do it towards like the sweep of my quad, and all through there's injection sites that you can do. So there's many places to do it there, and I don't find I need a ton of rotationary spots, but I've certainly done it in my biceps, in my triceps, in my rear delts, in my calves, which absolutely sucked ass. Like never, ever, ever am I going to do that again. And I hate glutes actually. I just don't love. I just feel like I don't know what I'm doing when I'm there because my ass can get fat. So I'm like, what am I shooting? I just feel really weird about it, I guess. But it is. I guess those are the easiest for me. Now, he did ask an interesting question, which again, I'm not a huge fan of, but I think there's utility in it. Where are bicep injection locations? Are you familiarized with that at all? Or
Not really, because typically another thing I will also mention is I try, as we all know, we don't want to inject directly into a vein. We don't want to do an intravenous shot. So honestly, areas which I find more vascular, also stay away for that reason too.
Mhm.
Another thing which I forgot to mention too is I also like to inject areas pre. Typically, I like to do shots pre-workout, and the reason for that is that I find that when I go, for instance, quads, right? If I'm going to go do legs, um,
Yeah,
obviously it can be a double-edged sword. So if you have a bad shot or something that contaminated, it can backfire. But I usually find if you're using quality pharmaceuticals and you're having good hygiene practices, it can actually reduce post-injection pain or swelling if you experience that by going and training that body part, having that increased blood flow to the area. I've had it with myself and many athletes before where they'll do like an injection like either first in the morning or late at night or just at random times during the day when they'll just be sitting, and then it would actually had even had an issue where an athlete was having an area of their skin get like really hard, as if like
mm,
the substance was basically pooling under their skin. And what literally fixed that was taking it pre-workout, going and train that area, get a lot of blood flow to that area, allowing basically the oil to dissipate
yeah,
and amalgamate easier sort of into the bloodstream, so to speak. So I usually find do it in an area where you're going to work out or have some blood flow, even if it's like cardio or something, and that can help with any sort of swelling or post injection.
yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, and if I was to do the biceps, which again I don't recommend this, because I think a lot of people can fuck this up pretty easy, and it's hard to do in isolation consistently. But how I would do it is you have like two bicep heads, and basically they kind of split down the middle, for lack of a better term. I always would go with the inside bicep head towards the tip right here, sort of like towards the head of my. I guess this arm's probably easier to use because I don't have a tattoo, but sort of like on this side, and try not to get, because if you get down the middle, that's a lot of vascular tissue. You can't really see it, but some people, when you're really lean, you can see that sort of split down the middle. So I try to go in. I think this is actually legitimately called the bicep major. I try to go in right here with an insulin syringe. Obviously, you don't want this super deep, and that seems to be effective. But again, I think it's so easy to get wrong because it's highly vascular, and very nerve dense. Like if I have lots of tattoos, so if anyone's ever gotten tattooed and they get like the inside of their arm done, that shit hurts really fucking bad. So I wouldn't typically recommend that. We got another question from S225. How do you guys deal with body hair?
Interesting. Um, I can go with that one.
Yeah.
So what I prefer, okay, I don't have it here on me, but what works, okay, look, this was different between how much body hair you have. Okay, so I'm quite fortunate. I don't have that much body hair to deal with. I can tell you what people who do with have a lot of body hair deal with in a moment. But typically, I use a body groomer. Reason being is it's sort of like a electric razor that you use for your head, but it's really a lot finer and basically gives you similar to shaving. The reason being is when I use any sort of like razor or anything like that, it can often cause skin irritation and ingrown hairs, which is something you want to not deal with. And also, I find it takes a bit longer. So, personally, I use a body groomer. You can just search on Google, like male hair body groomer, which basically will cut very close to the skin and allow you to basically look like you've shaved with a razor. And typically, I will get that and just do that once over, like once a week, or lazy once every 2 weeks, and I can deal with it. I know some individuals have used stuff like Veet. If you're familiar with that, it's basically a cream which you rub onto your skin, and that causes that causes the hair removal. It's a hair removal cream basically. But I found with that too, one, it's a bit tedious and takes a bit longer and can cause skin irritation. So me personally, body hair groomer. Now I do know some individuals who are a lot more hairy, and what they actually have done is gone actually for laser hair removal to reduce the amount of body hair that they have, so it becomes manageable. Colin, I was just basically saying body hair groomer over shaving or hair removal cream because those can cause irritation and ingrown
Yeah.
hairs. Body groomer is probably your least banana, more least likely to cause that. And if you've got so much hair, you might consider looking into getting some sort of laser treatment where you don't have to laser your whole body, but just enough laser to remove or reduce the amount of total body hair so it becomes more manageable.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Especially in like those sensitive areas like your groin or like your lower back or even your hamstrings. Like you can get, if you're using a razor, you can get lots of irritation and ingrown hairs, and that's not a pretty look either. So I do recommend, like, we have one in America. I'm not sure if you guys have it in Australia, but or Thailand, but it's the Philips One razor, and it's a
Okay.
body groomer. It's essentially an electric razor that's shaped like an actual like shaving razor, but it's an electric one and it gets really close to skin. That's the one I most often use and I recommend people use. Even pre-contest, it seems to work very well and it gets a close shave to the skin without causing that annoying irritation. Myself personally, I do use on my arms and my front of my legs and my calves, I will use a razor, but I use a very, very specific razor. And I don't buy male razors. I think male razors are shit. It's a scam. I actually buy Venus razors, like the female razors, and there's
I
this
do
this
too.
one with like yeah, they're the shit, dude. They have like pink pads on them that like lube up your skin as you're sliding it's just so perfect. It works in like one stroke across my arm, and it's like I've cleaned all that off, and I don't have to like go back and aggressively like go back and forth what you do with male razors, and you don't get that irritation due to like the soapy pads on the razor head itself. So I do use Venus razors if I am shaving, but I'm most of the time using the Philips One razor, which is like a typical body groomer, and that works really effectively as well. I try not to use Nair. I just don't think it's great to give yourself chemical burns, and I think it can absolutely cause like irritation on that like dermis layer and create inflammation, which you don't want, especially if you're pre-contest. You don't want that skin inflammation. So I'd recommend using more of like a actual like a Philips one head or a body groomer of any type, as it doesn't give you cuts. It's not going to create ingrown hairs, and it's just generally much quicker and easier. If you're shaving yourself with a razor, I mean, it's going to take hours, and it's not fun to have to dig in all those places with a goddamn razor. It's certainly not fun. So
Absolutely. Quick
yeah,
fun story that I can share with Nair. Well, not fun for me, but now I can reflect back on it and think it's funny. But basically, was using that to get rid of my body hair initially when I was younger. This was maybe like shit 10 years ago, maybe.
wow,
And I got had it all on my legs. You know, wrapped it all off, had the hair removal, went to the gym, and then on the way to the gym, I was like, why are my nuts on fire? Like, why are they burning so much? So much so, like, I ran into the gym, didn't scan anything, went to the bathroom, and then and saw basically some nair had basically still been like
no.
transferred to my balls basically, and it
Oh
was
my
just
god,
burning all around. I was like, and that then was never again using there. I was
Yeah.
like, fuck, and basically had chemical burns on my nuts, and was like, never again.
That's so
Never,
that's so terrible, man. I can't imagine. I'd be, like,
yeah,
thinking of every possible cause of why my nuts are burning, like, on the way there,
yeah,
like, going through every probable cause of, like, do I have
yeah,
STDs? Do I have an infection? Did I sweat too much? Like, what's going on? Yeah, that'd
yeah.
be terrible. No fun at all. We got another question. So, okay, so yo brother, I've always heard a good rate of for fat loss is 1% of your total body weight per week to minimize muscle loss, but I've seen some bodybuilders been able to drop 30 pounds in 12 week with no muscle loss. What is the fastest rate at which we're able to lose fat and still preserve muscle mass? This is a very tricky question, and I think that
Yes,
it's very genetically mediated, and it's not necessarily determinant of your ability to use. I mean, obviously, using a high degree of androgens is going to keep you from losing muscle more effectively, and that 1% to one, we usually say 1.5%. That's a for we see this in clinical research with natural individuals who
yes,
do not
yes,
have as efficient of diets as we do. So we say that 1.5 because anything exceeding that, the ratio of fat loss to muscle loss is almost not worth it. You almost get fatter as you lose muscle at that rate. But when you have androgens in place, obviously things are going to change a little bit, and that's why you can see bodybuilders sort of circumvent this issue, especially if they're obviously enhanced. Now, the thing is there's other bodybuilders out there. So, we just had him compete not too long ago. He got fourth place at the most recent show with that Nextzilla guy. I'm
oh
totally
yeah, very true
Nathan
about it.
Nathan Diasha. He preps for like 8 weeks and he just loses 60 pounds. And it's like, dude, what the hell? But it works out for him. And I think he's still undersized, but he could probably do better if he didn't do that. But that's like his thing. I think he's genetically gifted in that sense where he can drop weight rapidly fast and not experience the detrimental outcomes.
He gets
Whereas,
pretty puffy.
yeah, he exactly he gets really fluffy in the off season. And I'm very much the opposite, where, as I think just in general, a lot of white guys can be like this, where I will lose leg volume like a mofo if I cut shit really quick, and it's not pretty. Like I get really stringy and I'm tall, so it doesn't look good. Adam, I'd imagine maybe this might be the same for you too. I'm not sure, but so as a general rule of thumb, I try to approach it with almost everyone as I approach people as they're the standard and not the exception. People like Nathan Diasha and others are the exception and not the standard. And sometimes we idolize them as the standard. I treat people as they are the standard deviants. They're not like a wild genetic phenom. And so we lose or aim to lose at least 1 to 1.5% body weight total per week. And if they're not enhanced, certainly err on the side of caution, try to maintain that 1 to 1.5%.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you there. I think it is a general rule of thumb, which is very applicable to natural athletes. But when you enhance, that sort of all goes out the window. And in fact, instead of, I still, even with enhanced guys, I look at the rate of loss. And if it is above 1.5%, then what I do is personally, I start looking at other factors. So I start looking at what is training performance like? Because generally, I believe for the most part in a deficit phase, especially with anabolics, you're not doing an extreme fat loss phase and severely cutting calories, you should basically still maintain training performance, if not still able to have small little PRs along the way. So if we're losing body fat at more than 1.5%, let's say 2.5%, and there's no drops in training performance, there's no real drops in energy. Basically, we have a bunch of metrics that we check on our feedback and check in forms, as well as the ones that we track. And if those metrics like training performance, even can be such sleep, energy levels, pumps in the gym, all those things, if those are still maintaining and our rate of loss is like 2.5%, then we're fine. But
Mm.
on the opposite end of the scale, right, if we start seeing a massive nosedive in training performance and our rate is above 1.5%, that's when I'll pull back. So I don't get, necessarily married to the number specifically of that 1.5%, but you rather use that as like an initial gauge. Then I look at a bunch of other factors to look at the complete picture and go, okay, is this too fast or too slow based on that? Because as you correctly said, I've had competitors lose crazy amounts of weight really, really fast, where most people be like, oh, fuck, the guy's going to lose muscle weight. No muscle is lost.
Yeah.
And at the same time, some individuals where if they push like more than 1.5%, they start being like, oh shit, like I'm lethargic in the gym. Oh, it's hard for me to get pumped,
Mhm.
etc. When we really have to do a sustained, slower approach.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say too, like, it's also dependent, you shouldn't be you shouldn't be losing more than 60 pounds for a prep. Like if you are, you've done like it should be like a 20 to 25 pound difference. Obviously, it's not going to shake out to that most of the time, but that's ideal. And if you're losing that much, it's like when you begin that prep, you are holding in a great deal of excess adipose. If you're anywhere above 12% body fat, like you have a pretty solid fucking runway of adipose to use up prior to even worrying about muscle loss. So I'd say that first initial 4 to 5 weeks, like you can go pretty aggressive and exceed that 1.5%. But when you start getting lean, that's where you really start seeing what Adam was talking about, that lethargia, that sleep disruption, that performance, like literally just complete uh, degradation of performance. That's where you want to be more careful of how fast you begin to lose, because when you lose more body fat and you get leaner, the chance to lose more muscle mass is quite high because it's a highly demanding tissue, whereas fat is just simply there to be there. So yeah, 100%. um, okay, then we had another question from Michael. If Masteron isn't lowering estrogen sufficiently alongside testosterone, would y'all rather add some Primo alongside the Masteron, lower testosterone and raise Masteron above the 1-to-1 ratio, or throw in a aromasin, or I assume just any AI non-discriminating? It's funny you actually asked this because we had a similar issue just come up recently on the last check-ins, but you shoot first and we'll talk.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. Okay, so a bunch of things here. It's like we always I always try to make it more practical. So firstly, let's assume that we can get real prima bona, because that's one thing
Yeah.
which is quite important. And also, how do you tolerate it well? Because again, I've worked with a couple of athletes and coaches who seemingly don't tolerate prima bona well, or for instance, myself included, prima bona seems to cause significantly more hair loss. So
Mm,
let's assume that we can both use Maestron and Primobolan correctly with no serious, negative side effects that we aren't willing to accept, and that it's real. Me personally, depending on what phase of, so let's say you're in a massing phase and you want to push up and you really can't control estradiol from that. And this is assuming you're also doing daily administrations to get, so you've basically done everything else to mitigate your estradiol, try, bring it back into range. Personally, I would look at probably increasing the Maestron dose and lowering the testosterone to sort of match the anabolic load. If historically you have had, as we know, the metabolites from primobolan can act more as a aromatase inhibitor and lower it, and sometimes more efficaciously than primo and the masteron. So if we are having that, I would switch over to primobolan as the second point of call. So to give a timeline, personally, I would increase masteron first and then decrease testosterone. That being said, if it's significantly out of range, like I got blood work back and my estradiol was pretty out of range, then I would deploy an aromatase inhibitor. But let's say it's like 10 or 20% or 30% above the reference range, not double the reference range.
yeah.
Then first point of call is increase maestron, decrease testosterone. That still doesn't work. Then I would look at potentially deploying primobolan and further reducing the testosterone. If you got your blood work back and it's like double the reference range, triple the reference, or a significant amount, then I would deploy an aromatase inhibitor, specifically aromasin would be my preferred choice. Bring that into reference, bring that, do a sort of protocol depending on how high it was over a 2 to 4 week period. Retest your estradiol, see where it's at, see if we need any further reduction of it, and then switch to a combination of a higher maestron or DHT derivative dose, and then continue onwards like that. So it really depends on where the estradiol is sitting. So technically, all those answers are correct. It just
Yeah.
depends on how high it is.
Yeah, no, and I agree with everything you said, and I think, the 1-to-1 ratio of test to masteron is a good starting point for most people. But if you are
Yes.
experiencing, and here's the thing, guys, like a fucking, I mean, at least in the states, right? Not in Thailand, but in the states, an ultra sensitive estradiol assay is very cheap. It's like 20 fucking bucks. Like you can get this shit checked monthly without causing a dent in your bill. So what I recommend is, go, and if you, so let's say you're just globally experiencing high estrogen issues, which is where most people start. I would say just immediately increase the masteron, decrease the testosterone. So now instead of a 1-to-1 ratio, maybe you're at a, essentially like a 1-to-2 ratio, right, of testosterone masteron. And then go test your blood work, because now as that's taking effect, it's going to have a while before it actually has a sustainable effect. So go test your blood work to see where even is your estradiol, because maybe it's not elevated and maybe this is mediated through something completely different. But if you do test it and it is high and you're still experiencing symptoms, nipple sensitivity, so on, then okay, that's the use for something like an aromasin just acutely. Like maybe you start dosing 12.5 milligrams of aromasin once a week until 3 to 4 weeks later, when the mastron should be in full serum concentrations at that point. But I would say usually the first line of defense is for myself and Adam here is like we're going to lower testosterone, increase mastron, and I think as he said fairly, like primobolan is so often faked. I've rarely seen real primobolan ever, unless I'm buying it pharmaceutically and getting remobolan. I just don't think it's worth it, because then what happens is ultimately a lot of primobolan is just faked with testosterone, so or mastron. So ultimately what you're doing is like you're getting a 50-50. You're spending more money and it could be more testosterone, making the issue much worse, and then you're really like, what the fuck's going on? So I would generally say, increase mastron, decrease testosterone, and then get your blood work checked. If it is exorbitantly high and you are having symptoms, then deploy an AI like aromasin at 12.5 milligrams, maybe once a week if needed, twice a week if symptoms are still, relevant in the next following week. And then from there, retest, 4 weeks later, retest, see where your new estradiol is with the adjusted dose of mastron and testosterone. And then if you need to further tinker with that dose, you can do so. It's like that's the great part about being a bodybuilder, is no one's telling us what to do. You have the free and full liberty of your body to go do these things. So yeah, that's a great conclusion to that answer. But
Yeah, I think it was very
um
comprehensive.
so yeah. Okay, cool. So I think that's pretty good for the day, man. I don't know if you want anything else to cover, or
Yeah, we can cover it. I guess I just got this question come in. It's a quick one.
yeah.
I'm not too sure if you're familiar with, but the interference effect, where basically there's a bunch of research showing, and then I think the research on this is not wholly conclusive, and also we got to remember this is not on advanced athletes. But I got a question the other day about interviewers saying, "Hey Adam, why were you doing HIT post workout? Because
Mm.
that is going to interfere with anabolic signaling." So this, the basically the cascading effect of mTOR and how that basically affects anabolic signaling post workout. The idea is, in a nutshell, that if you are doing cardio post workout, that it's going to interfere with that anabolic signaling, and maybe you have more endurance adaptations rather than hypertrophy adaptations. So my answer to that is, if you are a natural athlete, I would potentially try put your cardio as far away from your workout as possible to not have that interference and also build up additional systemic fatigue. But in my specific scenario, I was there's two reasons why was not concerned with that. One, I am using PEDs, and I think that that mitigates a large part of it. And secondly, I'm also trying to bring down my resting heart rate. And if I'm temporarily foregoing a little bit of anabolic adaptations or signaling for getting my resting heart rate down so I do not die, that is more important than potentially a slight, I guess, reduction in anabolic signaling. So personally, if you're an enhanced athlete, I wouldn't worry too much about that interference post workout. If you are natural, I actually would concern, because there's with natural, there's you have less things to less variables to play with, so to speak. So you really have to get your sleep down pat. Not saying you shouldn't as an enhanced individual, but you really have to be more on point with things to really help accrue that muscle mass. So I would potentially look at doing it in the morning or as far away from your workout as possible. But if you're an enhanced, I wouldn't really worry too much about the interference effect, unless of course you're doing like an hour of hit or something
Yeah.
post workout. But 10, 12 minutes of hit or 10, 20 minutes of low intensity steady state cardio post workout, I don't think we'll have much interference. I mean,
Yeah,
what's your opinion?
I completely agree. I think the idea that 10 minutes of hit cardio is going to ruin your gains is just so valuable, especially when you're in a surplus. You have an abundance of calories, you have an abundance of insulin in your blood serum, whether you're using exogenous or not, because you're just eating more carbohydrate. It is so damn hard to lose muscle. Like, it is not easy, unless you just completely, fasted. And usually when I'm doing hit, it's fed too. It's not like I can usually perform hit much better if I'm fed as opposed to fasted. Whereas like low intensity cardio, I can do much better fasted than fed, um, because it's much more of a glycolytic thing. But it's 10 minutes is not going to be something that's going to derail your progress. I think arguably if you're a natural and you probably are in a slighter maybe you're not eating an abundance of calories, then it's probably not the best idea. But I think for people who need to be concerned about cardiac function, it's wildly more important than, let's just say it keeps you from making 3% of your gains, or maybe even 5%. I would say that the longevity of your career from having an optimal resting heart rate as compared to a, aberrant resting heart rate is going to obtain the results of that extra 5% through the length of your career than what you wouldn't. And it's like, then you have to think about the other off target effects of cardio too. It's like you have mitochondria biogenesis. So now you have more mitochondria. Oops, it's doing that thing again. More mitochondria, and which allows you, it's just me, I don't know why. You have more mitochondria, which allows you to partition nutrients, beta oxidize better, utilize more fats. You have now deeper capillarization in your muscles, which improves greater blood flow, improves nutrient delivery. You now have a greater cerebral blood flow, so your cognition is better. Your ability to, I would assume, enhance motor recruitment is much better. And in general, it's going to improve the long-term outcomes of your gym performance as it relates to hypertrophy outside of just getting better at cardio. There's a lot more that entails that, like, 10-minute window decreasing a small opportunity to create hypertrophy. It's like, what is going to happen on the longest time scale possible, and what's going to improve your outcomes. I would argue that the hit cardio, when you can manage the fatigue from it, is going to improve your outcomes in a much more fashionable sense than would, just completely abandoning cardio in the off season, especially when we're talking like health metrics, right? So yeah, that's a big thing.
Yeah, definitely. So, long story short, do a cardio, especially in a surplus. Worry about your heart. Don't worry about that 3% of anabolic signaling. And to be more consistent with your meals. Put that energy elsewhere, I would say.
Yeah, 100%. All right. Well, that sums it up. I gotta get back to Thanksgiving here. It's about 9 p.m., so I should, have maybe my nightly yogurt and say goodnight to everybody. But um, yeah, man, I appreciate you being on, and we'll be on next Thursday, from what I understand, and answering more questions. So if you guys have questions, make sure you follow us on Instagram. We post Q&As on there all the time, and we usually derive questions from there. Or if you feel like you want to, just comment below this video and ask any questions, and we'll address those at the beginning of the very next video. Or you could just simply tune in as we do these lives on Thursdays. They will be there for you, and you can ask questions live, and we'll get to them as soon as possible.
Yeah,
So
and yeah,
cool.
as you said, feel free to reach out to us. Send us, even if you just have questions, send it to us on Instagram, and we'll probably just add it to the pool of questions
100%.
so we'll chat about next live stream. Or
Yeah.
if I'm feeling in a good mood, I'll just answer you right then and there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Depends.
Right. Depending on how much time I have and how many clients are being onboarded, for sure.
If it's a song question, fuck off. I will
Yeah.
not answer that.
Yeah. No SARBs. No SARBs at all.
That's
All right, brother. We'll talk to you later.